welcome to another episode of the Hardcore Soft Skills Podcast. My name is Yadi Caro, and in each episode, I address with you a different skill with the help of an expert. How do you make decisions? Do you evaluate every possible alternative? Do you get the opinion of different people? Or do you just go with your gut? Decision making is a very necessary skill we need as leaders. We make thousands of decisions each day. For you, many of them will determine your future and the future of others. Today, you will learn the best approaches to decision making with a decision making expert. Cheryl Strauss Einhorn founded Decisive, a decision science company that trains people and teams in complex problem solving and decision making skills using the AREA method. AREA is an evidence based decision making system that controls for and counters cognitive bias to expand knowledge while improving judgment. And Cheryl developed this method during her 2 decades as an award winning investigative journalist, writing for publications including the New York Times, Foreign Policy Magazine, Barron's, and the Stanford Social Innovation Review. Cheryl teaches at Cornell University and has authored 3 books: Problem Solved, a powerful system for making complex decisions with confidence and conviction about personal and professional decision making; Investing in Financial Research, a decision making system for better results about financial and investment decisions; and a new book about problem solver profiles, Problem Solver: Maximizing Your Strengths to Make Better Decisions. Let's listen. All right. Thank you so much, Cheryl, for being here with me on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So it's been I've been reading both of your book. Well, you have more than 2 books, but I've been reading just recently, and I'm starting the other one. So 2 of your books, and I love how you present the approaches in terms of decision making and then setting the profile of a decision maker. So we'll talk more about that. But before we get started into delving into decision making, I want to know more about you, and our listeners want to know more about you. So why did you decide to focus on decision making, or even before that, what was your career? How did you decide to become, how did you ended up in decision making?
So, my background's actually in investigative journalism, and I ended up in decision making in part because of the kind of impact that my stories were having. I spent over a decade at the business magazine Barron's, and there I ended up specializing in what you might call the bearish company story. Those are stories that take a skeptical look at a company's finances or at their strategy. And because I was writing about mostly publicly traded companies, when the stories were published, there was often a very large reaction in the share price. Sometimes the stock exchange would halt the shares from trading because there was so much activity. Sometimes the regulators would get involved, like the Securities and Exchange Commission. Sometimes law enforcement, like the Justice Department, would get involved, or the FBI would raid one of the companies that I asked questions about. And what I began to realize is that it's not just somebody's investment portfolio that is being impacted. It's also somebody's retirement account if you had your savings in the shares of some of these companies. But it could also be your ability to get up and go to work in the morning if you worked at one of these companies, or it might be how you felt about the product or service of a company that I was writing about. And for one company, the CEO ended up being sentenced to 10 years in jail after a series of investigative articles. And about a half a dozen companies actually went out of business after the articles were written. And so I just started to thinking about, how do I know that I'm telling stories that are true, stories that should be told, that I'm marshaling good evidence, and that I am also checking and challenging some of my own assumptions and judgments that I might have about both the people and the information. And at the time, there was new research coming out saying, well, we all have these mental mistakes, these cognitive biases that impede clear thinking, but to try to tackle them, what we really need to do is to heighten our awareness. And I thought, well, if I'm a biased thinker, heightening my awareness might only mean that I'm doubling down on those biases. So I really started to think about, with my background in research, maybe I could put together a system for decision making to uniquely help control for and counter these mental mistakes, and really think about expanding our knowledge while improving our judgment. And that's what ultimately became what I call now my area method decision making system.
Wow. And first of all, amazing in terms of the impact. And I can't imagine the either the stress because of the rigorosity of the process of trying to come up, not just coming up with the topics, but investigating and then having to, I'm sure people will come at you and asking questions about how do you came up with that or things along those lines. That's amazing. And in terms of how that helped you inform the process, could you talk a little bit about how do you came about that area method? How did that what were some of the criteria used, some of the what were the foundations for that area method?
It's a great question. So there were a couple different pieces of criteria. One was this sort of awakening into the idea that our decisions are not ours alone, that we're always making them with other stakeholders. And so, in order to really have a fulsome understanding of the problems that I was addressing, I needed a way to move from one stakeholder perspective to another. And that's why AREA is set up as a perspective taking system. The second thing is that I wanted a way to uniquely control for and counter these mental mistakes. And by using the perspective taking, we're forcing ourselves out of how we see and think about the problem into how somebody else sees and thinks about it. And that distance, physical distance from us, also gives us some mental distance to make it easier to spot where we may be making assumptions and judgments. And then I also thought about including something entirely new in decision making, which is this idea of inserting late in the process creative exercises where we actually write down the problem and the evidence that we have and our hypotheses according to a creative exercise that I learned from the intelligence community, one that I learned from medicine, one that I learned from journalism. And each of these creative exercises actually help us to have a different interpretation of the data that we've collected. And then I also wanted to bring into decision making how to think about making mistakes before you make them and thinking about failure. And then I also wanted two other important pieces. One is to think about timing, because time is such a valuable resource. How is it that we could insert into the process some strategic stops to help us slow down and make our work for us and make us more agile decision makers? And then how also could we be more intentional about identifying success metrics before we start so that we actually know what has to happen in the outcome to know that the decision has succeeded for us. So those were sort of the guiding principles as I was putting together a process.
Yeah, that's very interesting because you're taking from a diversity of disciplines and taking into consideration, of course, our biases, and in terms of adding a lot of rigorosity in the process and making us accountable by, not spending paralysis by analysis. So in terms of establishing the
Right.
timing aspect. Now, could you talk a little bit about the area method? And for our listeners, right, definitely is a book that you must, as a must read, because it provides a lot of, in great detail, a great approach. Because we think about decision making, we think about going with our gut or things along those lines. That doesn't even a process. So, can you walk us through the area method?
Absolutely. So AREA is an acronym for the steps of my decision making system. The first A in AREA is absolute information from up close on the target of your decision. The R, the next perspective, is relative information. It's related to the target, but it puts the target into the broader ecosystem. Then
Mhm.
area E is actually exploration and exploitation, the twin engines of creativity. Exploration gets you beyond document based sources to identify good prospects and ask them great questions. It's fundamentally about interviewing. Area exploitation then uses these creative exercises so that you can delve more deeply into excavating your thinking to identify your assumptions and challenge them with evidence. And then the final A of area is the analysis phase where you think about failure and it helps you to bring the different parts of your process together to come to conviction on your decision. And I discuss the area method in detail in my first book, Problem Solved, which is about personal and professional decision making. And through the book, I take you through 4 examples of different types of decisions, 2 professional and 2 personal, so that you can see that no matter what you apply it to, you've had some anecdote or example in the book that can show you why that part of the process has been so useful to you.
Yeah, and what I love about the book as well, and it was eh, the one of the examples that you provide is you can see that by using that particular method, a person who was debating into which initiative or which particular problem to focus on, it was pertaining to human trafficking, that the by implementing this method he was able to obtain a focus approach and impact the life of somebody who was going to be not a victim of human traffic but before that person became a victim of the human traffic. So that was, I thought that was pretty powerful.
Thank you. Yeah, that is in my new book, Problem Solver, which is
Yes.
about what I've learned after publishing Problem Solved. Sometimes you have to write
Yes.
something missing. When I put Problem Solved and my area method out into the world, I was so surprised about the different types of people that were attracted to it and the different types of problems that they were solving. And one of the things that I realized, though, and I suppose this is true for any knowledge system, is that we don't use knowledge systems as they are, we use them as we are. So, students who
Mhm.
used my area method, they really liked relative research where you put a problem into context because they're used to doing literature reviews and finding information from third parties. But they were much less comfortable just looking up close at the target of their decision. Whereas in the intelligence community, for example, they were completely bought into conducting the interviews and exploration, but they felt like they didn't need to do the absolute research because, of course, they already knew the lay of the land. And so as I realized this, I began to think about, well, why is it easier for some people to actually look at parts of the process and to then feel less comfortable or want to shortchange other pieces? And this begs the question, therefore, well, who are you as a decision maker? And that brought up this idea that maybe there are a couple of different main archetypes for how we approach decisions. And then Problem Solver identifies 5 of what I call problem solver profiles. And then it helps you take a quiz to learn how do you approach decisions. And then it shares with you, what does this mean you're good at in your decision making? And what parts of area are you more likely to be drawn to? And then what are some key cognitive biases that get in your way, which can help you to understand why do you skip other parts of problem solving? And then how do you make better decisions with the other people with whom you make decisions in your life?
Yes, I really enjoy that book as well because it's, of course, a great. One book must go with the other. You must. The fact that I enjoy is that I took the quiz and I did the profile. The the assessment of the profile, and I turned out to be an adventurer and a listener. So I thought that was pretty interesting in terms of an adventurer, I guess more in terms of, it is true that I don't necessarily go through all the details of a criteria, but let's talk about those different profiles. Could you summarize them a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So the five profiles, and they each have beautiful strengths. I gave them fun names because we think in language, and if I gave it fun names, it would help you find it
Mm-hmm.
more memorable. They are the adventurer, the detective, the listener, the
Mm-hmm.
thinker, and the visionary. The adventurer is an optimistic decision maker. She really is thinking about forward momentum, and so she can make a lot of decisions. But the blind spot for that is an optimism bias. She tends to think that if she makes a decision and it goes awry, she has the next decision ahead. And so you can see
Mm-hmm.
that that helps her make a lot of decisions, but it also means that therefore she doesn't really necessarily have to spend a lot of time on a decision because the next decision is ahead. The detective, and I'm a detective, is a decision maker who really wants evidence, and she thinks of evidence as facts. And
Mm-hmm.
so she can have an underlying confirmation bias because she feels comfortable doing research and she can go out and find data that favors a confirmed hypothesis, whereas disconfirming data would actually be something that could be more useful. The listener is a collaborative, cooperative decision maker, and she likes to really gain the wisdom of others. She often has a trusted group of advisors. And a blind spot for her might be the liking bias. She may overweight information that comes from somebody that she has an affinity for. The thinker is our slowest decision maker. This is somebody where the action is between their ears. They really want to understand the why, and so, therefore, they spend a lot of time in problem solving as opposed to decision making. They're careful and they're cautious. And so, a blind spot for them would be a loss aversion because what they often want to do is prevent a decision from failing instead of finding either the best possible outcome or the best outcome possible for their decision. And then finally, you have the visionary, a creative, original type of thinker, somebody who, when you're in conversation, you may wonder, gee, is that person off topic?
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, they are somebody who can have a blind spot of a scarcity bias where they tend to overvalue something that is rare when maybe something that is ordinary or workaday might be just fine. So, what I want you to see is that each of these have different things that they're optimizing for. It means that they value different parts of decision making. No one is better than the other, and it's not proscriptive. Your problem solver profile, when you take the quiz, is not going to tell you what you're going to do later today or
Mm-hmm.
a year from now, but it is your habit and pattern of behavior that's comfortable for you, the way that most of us find doing things with, let's say, our right hand or our left hand more comfortable, even though we could, with a lot of effort, learn to be ambidextrous.
Hmm. So does that mean that the our profiles, are they fixed or could they change depending on the situation or depending on our
Yes.
approach?
So they can definitely change. First, they can change with time by putting in some effort. And I invite all of you, if you take the problem solver profile and you find out that you, like Yadi, are an adventurer, maybe you pick a couple decisions that you make from the vantage point of the other problem solver profiles. You could try buying insurance like a detective, making a meal like a visionary, going to the supermarket like a listener, and so on. And you can choose to lean into some of these other profiles and think about what's uncomfortable about this. And the more that you work with it, like uncomfortable mobility exercises for wrestlers, you can become more flexible and more dynamic as a decision maker. So that's one way that we can change. And the second way is something that I call situationality, which is how our environment impacts us. There are going to be times where the environment overrides how we would normally show up in a situation.
Mhm.
whether it is a situation where we feel fear or something that is so new to us, or where we're in a power dynamic where we want to show a certain amount of deference and maybe withhold how we would normally come forward. And learning the recipe of situationality can help you to think about, am I really happy with the way that I'm changing in this situation? Because sometimes it's quite appropriate. Or do I feel like I really want to be bringing my more authentic self? And then you can help to diagnose what's getting in the way.
Interesting. And when you have been reading that you have come up with these different profiles, and you've amassed data sets with thousands of different profiles from people who have taken the test around the world. Are there any tendencies that you have seen? What are some of the trends that and in terms of the distribution of the responses for those profiles?
Yeah, so I've amassed, I think, over 6,000 responses since the book has come out. And what I have found is that the biggest result is the thinker, problem solver
Oh,
profile. And I have some hypotheses about this, which Harvard Business Review and the Stanford Social Innovation Review, these are places that have published articles about my new book, Problem Solver. And when you think about who might be in the readership for a Harvard Business Review, for example, it might well be a lot of people who are very interested in mining and learning information from other people. And the thinker does have an underlying authority bias where they do tend to overweight the opinions of people who seem to come from authority. So it might be that their readership has then come to take the quiz. And
mm-hmm.
it might also be, though, that somebody who's an adventurer may read about the profiles and say, I know exactly which one I am. I actually don't need to take a quiz. And so you might have thinkers, detective listeners, much more open, willing, and curious to take a quiz. So in the upcoming months, I'm hoping to add some questions to the end of the problem solver profile, which people can answer if they'd like to help out with our understanding of the research that we're collecting.
Very interesting. And when it comes to our listeners that they want to learn more how to develop the skill of becoming a better decision maker, of course, recommending them to read your work and do the test as well. If there's a, what first step do you think they will need to take to start just taking a step towards just becoming a conscious or better decision maker?
Yeah. So I'm glad you brought this up because in all of my books, I have something that I call cheetah sheets. So the cheetah, she's the fastest land animal. She accelerates over 60 miles an hour, but her hunting prowess actually comes from decelerating up to 9 miles an hour in a single stride. And the reason why that is so powerful in hunting is that gives you agility, flexibility, and maneuverability. And that's what you need in a quality decision making system. So, in all of my books, I have what I call cheetah sheets, which are areas that ask you to decelerate and to take a strategic stop. And there I have a worksheet, and those worksheets are filled with exercises. So you can literally rip the skills right off the page, fill out the cheetah sheet, and help yourself to plug it right into your life. So, one of the first things that you can do once you learn your problem solver profile is to do what I call a rear view mirror exercise. And the steps of this I have in one of the very early cheetah sheets in my new book, Problem Solver, where you can reflect, how does this sound like me? Can I think of a decision that I've made that reflects that I am an adventurer or a detective, and so on? And then you can use the questions to guide you through an introspection about what this means and what you might want to do differently in the future.
Great. So all these great resources, of course, in terms of becoming just taking steps towards better decision making, and it's a skill set that we definitely all need to improve upon. And in terms of other aspects of your work that you would like people to know about, you've also have published in terms of decision making, other books in terms of finance, or what other areas you think that we should cover today in terms of your work that you think will benefit the listeners?
Sure. So I do have three books on decision making. The first one we talked about briefly is called Problem Solved, and that introduces the area method, and that's on personal and professional decisions. My second book is called Investing in Financial Research, and that is on financial and investment decisions. I wrote this book originally for my students at Columbia Business School, where I taught in the finance department, to help them with applying a system for complex problem solving, specifically to those kinds of financial and investment decisions. And then the new book, Problem Solver, is the research into problem solver profiles, decision archetypes, and to helping you really to be able to strengthen your relationships as you make better decisions with others. So those are the three books. And then I think the other thing that's really important is that we all end up working in teams in a way where we haven't really thought about the intellectual diversity of the groups that we're working with. We may see diversity, we may hear it in the way that people have different speech patterns, or they seem to have a different primary language that they come from, but we don't see intellectual diversity, even though it dawns on us over time that people do tend to make decisions differently. So what I think is really important that we haven't discussed is this idea that we do tend to think that our way is better than others.
Mm-hmm.
And that the problem solver profiles are an invitation to understand that you no longer have to think that your way is better, it's simply different. And that it is the collection of the intellectual diversity of the different profiles that really give you the fulsome understanding of the decisions that you face. And that can give you greater appreciation for the colleagues with who you interact every day.
That is a great insight in terms of how we can just benefit or use that as an asset for our teams to having different people with diversity of decision making skills. That's very interesting. So, and before we go, how can people know more about your work or if they wanted to get in contact with you?
Thank you. So my website is area method, AREA method.com. And, I hope that you will reach out so that you can find out more about your problem solver profile so that you can work better with your teams, so that you can get coaching and professional development work that can help you around your decisions. And I hope that you'll also go to app.areamethod.com where you can take the problem solver profile, and then by reading problem solver, you can learn how to use this information more deeply. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you so much, Cheryl, for sharing your knowledge today. This has been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening today. Before you leave, make sure you go to my website, hardcoresoftskillspodcast.com, and sign up for my weekly newsletter. Then go to the review tab and leave a review. It is the way to ensure this podcast is discovered by others. Remember that by learning soft skills, you make your hard skills work for you. See you next time.